It begins with the sound of laughter. The kind of laughter that carries across fields, weaving through the smell of fresh earth and spring blossoms. Children run barefoot across the grass, clutching ribbons of crimson, gold, and green, their voices rising like birdsong as they circle the towering maypole planted at the heart of the village square. For a moment, everything feels untouched by sorrow. The air is alive with music, pipes, fiddles, and the hollow thump of a drum guiding the dance. Women balance baskets of bread and wildflowers on their hips. Men drink from earthen mugs of ale, and the entire countryside seems to shimmer with color. To the casual eye, it is a picture of joy, a timeless tradition, marking the return of warmth and light after the cruel bite of winter. The maypole itself rises like a beacon of life, adorned with garlands, crowned with blossoms, its ribbons flowing like veins that connect the people to the earth itself. This is what May Day was meant to be, a celebration of fertility, abundance, renewal. A brief, precious escape from the hunger and toil that define the other 364 days of the year. But beneath the ribbons, beneath the music, something else was stirring. An undercurrent as invisible as it was undeniable. Watch closely. Notice how some faces, smiling in the sun, carry shadows in their eyes. How the hands that weave flowers into wreaths are rough, blistered, scarred by labor that never ends. These are not the hands of people truly free to celebrate. These are hands forced to surrender nearly everything they produce to those who live in stone houses on the hill. Those same landlords, dressed in fine wool and velvet, stand at the edge of the square, cups of wine in their palms, watching as though the festival were not their tradition but their possession. For centuries, this village, like countless others, had bowed under the weight of their demands. Endless rents, impossible tithes, punishments delivered without mercy. Families starved while their lords feasted. Children wasted away while livestock fattened in the lord's granaries. And yet, on this day, for a few stolen hours, peasants and laborers were expected to smile, to bow, to entertain those who had made their lives unbearable. The maypole was not just a symbol of spring. It was also a stage, a performance of obedience dressed in ribbons and laughter. The villagers knew their place, or at least they had always pretended to. But as the sun rose higher, as the ale flowed, as the music spun faster, something else began to take root in their hearts. Call it desperation, call it rage, call it the unbearable weight of generations pressing down until the body, the soul, could endure no more. There is something almost cruel about joy when it rests on a foundation of suffering. Every laugh becomes sharper, every ribbon a reminder of what has been taken, every song a hollow echo of lives crushed under boots. The contrast was unbearable, and that contrast is what made this day different. By dusk, the maypole would no longer be draped only in flowers and cloth. Its ribbons would tangle with rope, its blossoms drip with blood. The very pole that stood as a symbol of renewal would be transformed into an altar of vengeance. No one who witnessed it would ever see the May festival in the same way again. For on this day, when the world was supposed to be reborn into light, the village chose to drag its oppressors into the shadows. Imagine standing there as twilight fell, the music faltering, replaced by something heavier in the air. The lords, flushed with wine and arrogance, sneering at the peasants who bowed too slowly, danced too clumsily. And the villagers, faces still painted with smiles, but behind their eyes, a fire. One moment, a dance. The next, a scream. A wine cup shattering in the dirt. Heavy boots dragged across the square. The festival tree creaking under a weight it was never meant to bear. It is said that when the first body was raised, the crowd fell silent, not in horror, but in a stillness that bordered on awe, as though a forbidden prayer, long whispered in secret, had finally been answered. The maypole, once a thing of beauty, became a thing of terror. Children were pulled away, women dropped their flowers, men stood frozen with blades still wet in their hands. And yet, no one stopped. By the time night blanketed the village, 22 men of property, landlords, bailiffs, overseers, were strung up among the ribbons. Their fine clothes shredded, their jeweled rings torn away, their bodies swaying against the garlands that only hours before had promised life. The square stank of sweat, smoke, and iron. The laughter that had opened the day was gone, replaced by the heavy silence of history being made. This was no ordinary festival. It was a reckoning, a rebellion born not in the battlefield, but in the heart of tradition itself. The villagers had chosen their moment with chilling precision. The Maypole was never meant to carry such weight, but on that night, it bore the burden of centuries of rage. And so the story begins, not with kings or soldiers or parliaments, but with ordinary men and women, peasants whose names the world has forgotten, standing beneath a festival tree that had become something darker. They did not know how the outside world would respond. They did not know the punishment that would follow. All they knew was that, for one night, the balance of power shifted. For one night, they were no longer subjects. For one night, the Maypole belonged to them. Hunger is the cruelest teacher. It strips away dignity, gnaws at patience, and carves desperation into the bones of those who endure it. To understand why the ribbons of a Maypole turn to nooses, you must first step into the daily life of the peasants who built that festival with their blistered hands. Picture a family in the months before the uprising. Their home a single-room cottage with smoke-stained rafters, their bread stretched so thin it was more straw than wheat. Every dawn meant labor from first light until nightfall, plowing, sowing, harvesting. But for all their effort, the fruits of their toil were never their own. The Lord's men came first, demanding their share, and then the church, insisting on tithes. What remained was barely enough to keep children alive through winter. Many did not survive. The system that ruled them was as old as memory itself, feudalism, dressed up in the language of duty and loyalty. In theory, it was a bond between protector and protected. In practice, it was a chain around the necks of the poor. Land was everything. Land meant food, survival, the possibility of future generations. But the land was never theirs. It belonged to the landlords, men who could not have plowed a straight furrow to save their lives, yet who held power to decide whether others would eat, or starve, or even live. To those landlords, peasants were not people but resources, like cattle or soil, expendable, interchangeable. They exacted rents not in coin alone, but in bushels of grain, in hours of unpaid labor, in humiliations designed to remind everyone who held the whip. Miss a payment, and your cow was seized. Speak out, and your wife might be dragged into the manor yard to scrub floors until her knees bled. Defy too openly, and punishment could be swift and public. Beatings, stocks, even gallows erected as examples to others. And yet, the cruelty of this oppression was not only physical. It was psychological. Generations grew up knowing they were born into servitude, their futures mapped out before they even spoke their first words. There was no dream of escape, no promise of advancement, only the slow grind of days chained to the will of men who treated their suffering as entitlement. The lords could smile, raise a glass at the festival, and believe that this was order, the natural shape of the world. But resentment does not vanish, it festers. And in this village, in that year, it festered hotter than ever. The winter had been harsh. Crops had failed under relentless rains, and granaries echoed with emptiness. Families boiled weeds into soup, gnawed bark from trees, begged at the doors of monasteries that were themselves running dry. Yet the landlords had not relented. They demanded more, citing debts, citing rights, citing the need to host their feasts and maintain their hunting hounds. The peasants watched their children waste away while oxen were slaughtered for banquets held behind manor walls. It was not just hunger that hollowed them. It was humiliation. To starve while watching your masters revel was to be reminded daily that your suffering was entertainment for others. The festival of May Day was supposed to be different, a time when even the poorest were allowed a taste of joy, a measure of freedom. The villagers looked forward to it with a desperate longing, stringing together what meager offerings they could. Cakes baked with the last of the flour, ribbons cut from scraps of worn clothing, flowers gathered at dawn. But even this was tainted by the Lord's intrusion. They arrived in fine silks, their boots polished, their cheeks flushed from wine long before the first dance began. They expected to be honored, bowed to, served, even as they claimed ownership of a celebration that was never theirs. Every act of kindness the villagers extended, a jug of ale poured, a song sung, a garland offered, was twisted into performance for their overlords. To smile in the face of the men who took your grain, To laugh in the presence of the men who mocked your poverty. To kneel, even in play, before the boots that crushed you. That was the stage on which the festival unfolded. And yet, the landlords could not see the danger. They never could. From their vantage point, peasants were meek, resigned, broken. They mistook survival for submission. They mistook silence for obedience. They believed that centuries of dominance had erased the possibility of rebellion. But under the surface, in whispered conversations by hearths, in muttered curses exchanged at the well, the truth was alive. The villagers were not broken. They were waiting. The maypole itself symbolized this tension. To the peasants, it was a link to something older, something sacred, rites that long predated the feudal chains. It was about the earth, renewal, the cycles of life. To the landlords, it was a curiosity, a diversion, a backdrop for their smug indulgence. The two visions could not coexist. This is where the contrast becomes unbearable. Imagine the sound of a fiddle, lively and sweet, against the echo of a child's empty stomach. Imagine a garland of flowers, bright and fragrant, against the memory of a wife buried the previous winter, starved before her time. Imagine laughter in the square, while only days before, a farmer was whipped for failing to deliver grain he never had. These contradictions tore at the soul. They made the festival less a celebration and more an insult. Every ribbon wound around the pole was a reminder of the invisible ropes already tightening around the peasants' throats. Every cheer from the lords was salt ground into wounds of hunger and despair. The village was at a breaking point, and though no one could have predicted the scale of what would follow, the signs were there for anyone willing to see. Rage does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes it builds like pressure in the earth, silent, invisible, until the ground itself shatters beneath your feet. And so, as the May festival approached that year, the air was already charged with something unspoken. The lords looked forward to their amusement. The villagers prepared as they always had, with ribbons and music and offerings of bread. But behind their eyes lingered a new intensity, a weight carried in silence. Generations of suffering had piled into a single unbearable truth. They had nothing left to lose. The stage was set, the ribbons hung, the ale brewed, and in the shadows of the festival square, the roots of resentment had grown too deep to be hidden. All it would take was a spark. The spark that set the festival ablaze did not arrive with fanfare. It never does. Revolutions rarely begin with grand speeches or sweeping declarations. They begin with a single insult, a single act of cruelty, so ordinary in its violence that it might have passed unnoticed in any other year. But this time, the wound cut deeper. Some say it began when a landlord, already drunk on wine before the midday sun had reached its peak, mocked a farmer who had offered him bread. The loaf, small and coarse, had been baked from scraps of barley and weeds, meant as a humble gift. The landlord, sneering at its poverty, hurled it into the dirt, trampling it beneath his boot, while laughing that peasants should eat what pigs refused. For a man who had watched his own children cry from hunger, that laugh was a knife twisting in the gut. Others whispered of another incident. A young girl, no more than 12, pulled into the square by a bailiff who demanded she dance for the amusement of the lords. When her father tried to protest, he was struck down with a cudgel, his face bloodied while the gentry clapped their hands in merriment. Or perhaps it was simpler still. Perhaps the spark had already been smoldering in the hearts of the villagers, waiting for any excuse. The festival merely gave them a stage. The lords provided the cruelty, and fate itself struck the match. What is certain is this. By late afternoon, as the sun burned high and the drums echoed through the square, whispers had begun to circulate. Whispers carried not on the wind, but from mouth to mouth, disguised as laughter, hidden behind smiles. The peasants knew each other's pain. They had buried children in the same frozen ground, shared crusts of bread in the same lean years, endured the same whips and jeers. Now, in the shadow of the maypole, they shared something else, a single, unspoken agreement. Enough. It is impossible to know who first gave voice to the thought. Perhaps it was the widow who had lost 2 sons to starvation. Her grief hardened into a quiet fury. Perhaps it was the shepherd whose flock had been seized by a lord's men for unpaid rent. Or perhaps it was a woman whose tongue was sharper than the men around her, whose whispers had long stirred discomfort and now sharpened into resolve. History forgets names when they belong to the poor, but memory keeps the feeling alive, a sudden, electric unity that passed between them like a current. The ale helped. Liquid courage, dulling fear and sharpening anger, filling their veins with the sense that they were not alone. In the tavern corners, words turned bolder. A fist slammed against a wooden table, a voice muttered, "They feast while our children starve." Another, "This day is ours, not theirs." Then, a third, "The Maypole can hold more than ribbons." Outside, the festival still glittered with music and dancing, but beneath that surface, the ground was shifting. Every bow of a fiddle string, every laugh from a lord, every twirl of a ribbon wound the villagers tighter, like a rope drawn taut. And once stretched to breaking, a rope does not relax, it snaps. By evening, as twilight spread across the fields, the moment arrived. Perhaps it began with a shove too forceful or a blade drawn too quickly. Perhaps a voice rang out, one that could not be ignored. A woman crying out for justice, a man bellowing a call to arms. Whatever form it took, it spread like fire leaping from straw to straw, impossible to contain. The lords, caught off guard, believed it was a drunken scuffle, nothing more. They jeered, lifted their cups, mocked the peasants' anger. But the peasants did not stop. They surged together, a tide of rough hands and blunt weapons, scythes, pitchforks, knives pulled from belts. Their anger had found its form. And for the first time in living memory, the lords realized the festival was no longer theirs to command. Panic flickered. The lords barked orders at their servants, at their bailiffs. But the crowd was too large, too unified. The bailiffs themselves faltered, seeing the fury in the eyes of the people they had beaten and extorted. Some dropped their weapons, others joined the chaos, but none could stop what had been unleashed. It is said that when the first rope was fetched, silence fell across the square, as though the entire village held its breath. The Maypole, so carefully decorated that morning, loomed above them, its ribbons fluttering in the night air. It was as though the festival itself had chosen sides. What had begun as whispers was now action. The spark had caught, the fire had begun to burn, and there would be no turning back. This was not mere violence, it was ritual. Every hand that grabbed a rope, every voice that shouted in fury, was shaped by generations of suffering. This was vengeance not for one insult, not for one loaf of bread or one child struck in the square. This was vengeance for centuries, and it would not stop at one body. By the time the torches were lit and shadows danced across the cottages, the uprising had become unstoppable. The festival of renewal had been reborn into something else entirely, a festival of reckoning. And somewhere, in the blur of shouts and footsteps, a realization took hold. The peasants were no longer afraid. The lords had always held power through fear, but fear, once broken, does not return. What replaced it was far more dangerous: certainty. Certainty that the lords could bleed, that the lords could fall, that the lords could be made to hang from the very tree they had mocked with their presence. The spark had caught flame. The shadows of the festival deepened, and the Maypole, once a symbol of spring, now waited for its darkest purpose. Night fell heavy upon the village, but the air was anything but still. The drums that had once guided the dances now thudded like war beats, uneven and frantic. The ribbons, swaying in the evening breeze, no longer seemed playful. They twisted in the torchlight like serpents, like veins, waiting to drink. The first strike was not heard by all. It was muffled in the back of the square, someone dragged from a bench, a scream cut short by a fist, the dull crack of wood against bone. But what followed carried across the entire festival ground, a cry, sharp and ragged, that silenced fiddle's mid-note. Heads turned. Cups froze mid-air. For a heartbeat, the world teetered in confusion. And then came the roar. It was not the roar of one man, nor even a handful. It was the collective voice of a people who had swallowed their anger for too many winters, too many humiliations, too many graves dug for children who had starved while their masters feasted. That roar broke the night open. The landlords had no chance to prepare. Their fine cloaks and jeweled rings were worthless armor against scythes swung with desperation, against pitchforks wielded with the strength of famine. They stumbled backward, wine spilling from their goblets, their mouths shouting orders that no one obeyed. Servants hesitated, frozen between fear of their masters and the fury of their kin. The bailiffs tried to fight, but their cudgels clattered uselessly as villagers swarmed them like wolves upon sheep. The square, once a place of dance, became a battlefield. Tables overturned, mugs shattered, torches knocked loose to cast wild shadows across the cottages. The music of the festival dissolved into the guttural soundtrack of violence. Shouts, groans, steel scraping stone, the high-pitched wail of someone struck down. But even amid the chaos, there was focus. This was not blind slaughter. The crowd moved with eerie purpose, their eyes drawn again and again to the towering maypole. Its ribbons fluttered above them like a challenge, its flowers wilting in the heat of torches. And then, someone lifted a rope. No one remembers who tied the first knot, who dared the first throw. But when the rope sailed up, looping over the wooden beam, the crowd erupted. It was as though centuries of silence had been waiting for that single gesture. The maypole was no longer a decoration. It had become the gallows of justice. The first landlord to be seized fought wildly, clawing at his captors, shrieking that they would all burn for this heresy. His velvet cloak tore from his shoulders as he was dragged to the pole. His pleas turned to curses, his curses to screams, until the rope closed around his throat. A shove, a heave, and his body lifted, limbs jerking as the crowd below watched. For a moment, silence fell. The creak of wood under strain echoed louder than any shout. And then, from the villagers, a sound. Not cheers, not laughter, but something lower, darker. A murmur of satisfaction, a sigh of vengeance released. One became two. Two became five. The landlords were rounded up, one by one, dragged screaming through the dirt. Some fought, some begged, some collapsed in shock, their fine clothes dragging behind them like funeral shrouds. But none escaped. The villagers worked with grim determination, their hands steady, their ropes firm. They knew what they were doing. They had dreamed of this moment through endless nights of hunger, and now it was real. By the 10th body, the maypole had transformed completely. Its ribbons tangled with rope, its flowers crushed beneath boots, its once celebratory form grotesque under the weight of swaying corpses. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and iron, the metallic tang of blood. Torches flickered against the faces of the dead, their tongues swollen, their eyes glassy, their jewelry stripped away by grasping hands. Children were pulled back into cottages, hidden from the sight, but they could still hear. The thud of boots, the guttural cries, the sickening snap of necks. Women clutched their little ones close, whispering prayers not to God, but to ancestors who might forgive what they were witnessing. By the 15th body, the crowd had grown almost silent. The frenzy had burned away, replaced by a heavy solemnity. They no longer moved like a mob, but like participants in a ritual. Each landlord raised was not just a man. It was the embodiment of centuries of cruelty being exorcised. Their deaths were sacrifices to the justice the villagers had been denied by crown and church alike. And still it did not stop. 17, 19, 20. The square was a vision from nightmare. Shadows of corpses swayed across the cobblestones, their shapes grotesque against the walls. Dogs barked and whimpered, sensing something unnatural in the air. The maypole groaned under the weight, but it held, as though fate itself had ordained it for this dark duty. By the time the 22nd body hung from its ropes, the square was quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of exhaustion, of awe, of fear at what had just been unleashed. The villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath heavy, their faces lit by firelight, their hands trembling with the knowledge that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The festival had become a massacre, and yet there was no cheering, no revelry, only the sound of the wind rustling through the ribbons, now indistinguishable from the ropes that swayed with the dead. Some would later claim they felt pride that night, that for once, justice had been theirs to deliver. Others confessed only horror, unable to sleep for the images burned into their minds. But whether in satisfaction or regret, none could deny that they had stood together, that they had defied the order of the world, if only for a single night. The square was littered with torn garments, shattered mugs, blood-darkened soil. The music had died hours ago, replaced by silence that weighed heavier than any drum. The maypole loomed above it all, a monstrous parody of what it had been that morning. Once crowned with blossoms, it was now crowned with corpses. Once wrapped in bright ribbons, it was now knotted with rope. Where it had stood as a beacon of renewal, it now marked the village forever as the place where joy and death entwined. As the villagers drifted back to their cottages, some clutching spoils torn from the landlord's bodies, others empty-handed but dazed. One truth lingered: the old world had cracked open. They did not yet know what dawn would bring: reprisal, execution, erasure. But for that night, they had tasted power. And power, once tasted, is never forgotten. The Maypole creaked in the night wind, its burden swaying, a grotesque dance in the moonlight. And though no words were spoken, every villager understood the same thing. They had bound themselves not just in rebellion, but in blood. Morning broke with a silence that felt unnatural, as though the village itself had stopped breathing. The festival square, once alive with song and laughter, now lay in ruin. Smoke still clung to the air from torches left to burn through the night. Broken mugs and splintered tables littered the ground, stained with wine, mud, and blood. And at the center, towering above all, the Maypole stood transformed into a grotesque monument. Ribbons tangled with rope, blossoms wilted, corpses swaying gently in the dawn breeze. The villagers emerged from their cottages slowly, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Some crept forward in disbelief, as though hoping the night's horrors had been a dream. But the sight of 22 bodies twisting in the early light left no room for doubt. What had been done could not be undone. There was no celebration, no triumphant cries of freedom, only the heavy weight of realization settling over every man, woman, and child. They had crossed a line that centuries of fear had kept intact. They had not just resisted, they had slaughtered their masters in ritual fashion, on holy ground, during a festival meant for life. The enormity of it pressed upon them like a storm cloud, and with it came a silence more haunting than screams. Some villagers felt grim satisfaction. For once, justice had been seized with their own hands. They walked among the bodies, spitting at faces that had once ordered their whippings, stripping boots and rings as payment for years of stolen grain. Yet even they did not smile. The act of vengeance had released something raw and primal, but it had also left behind a gnawing emptiness. Others wept openly. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding their eyes from the dangling figures, whispering prayers that God might forgive what they had witnessed. Old men shook their heads, muttering that the punishment to come would be worse than any misery the landlords had ever inflicted. Fear crept into the cracks of their newfound defiance. Because they all knew the same truth, word would spread. And when it did, the wrath of authority would fall upon them like a hammer. It did not take long. By the third day, travelers carried rumors to neighboring towns. Stories twisted with every retelling. Some claimed the villagers had sacrificed the landlords to pagan gods. Others whispered of satanic rites performed around the Maypole. Whether truth or invention, the effect was the same. Shock, horror, and outrage spread like wildfire. This was no mere crime. It was sacrilege. Priests were the first to condemn them, thundering from pulpits that the villagers had defiled the sacred joy of May Day with murder. Sermons warned that such evil would invite plague, famine, or eternal damnation. What had been a desperate act of survival was now branded as heresy. Then came the soldiers. Marching beneath banners of the crown, armored men arrived at the village with orders to make an example. They found the Maypole still burdened with bodies, some stiff, others rotting, the stench carrying for miles. To the soldiers, this was proof of barbarity. To the authorities, it was rebellion against the natural order of the world. And rebellion, no matter how small, could not be tolerated. The reprisals were swift and merciless. Dozens of villagers were dragged from their homes in chains, beaten until bone cracked. Men were interrogated, forced to confess names of ringleaders they did not have. Women were whipped, accused of witchcraft, of poisoning their men with rage. Even children were not spared. The sons of the executed landlords demanded vengeance, and vengeance fell upon any peasant old enough to lift a tool. Public executions followed. Gallows were erected not in secret squares, but in market towns, where villagers for miles around were forced to watch. Those accused of leading the uprising were hanged slowly, their deaths drawn out as warnings. Others were burned, their screams framed as purging fire for their supposed sins. The crown wanted to erase not just the bodies of the guilty, but the idea itself, that ordinary peasants could defy their masters. The village itself was scarred. Homes were searched, granaries confiscated, livestock slaughtered in reprisal. The very soil seemed marked by blood. Survivors were ordered never to speak of what had happened, under threat of death. The Maypole was torn down, its timber burned in a public ceremony meant to cleanse the place of its blasphemy. But fire cannot erase memory. Those who lived on carried the weight in silence. They spoke of the uprising only in whispers, behind closed doors, if at all. Children grew up knowing that their parents had done something unspeakable, though the details were never given. The story passed like a shadow, unwritten in books, unrecorded by officials, kept alive only in fragments of folk song and half-remembered tales. The official histories buried the uprising. Chroniclers, funded by the very class of landlords who had been slaughtered, wrote of peasant madness, of demonic possession, of savagery unfit for civilized men. They described the landlords as innocent victims, martyrs of order and law. The peasants themselves were reduced to nameless mobs, faceless monsters. Their reasons, their hunger, their desperation, all erased. Yet the villagers remembered differently. Though they dared not speak openly, they carried the memory in their bones, in the silence of festivals that no longer felt pure. Some refused to raise a maypole again, fearing it had been cursed forever. Others decorated it with fewer ribbons, whispering prayers that it might never again be stained with blood. The aftermath was not just punishment, it was silence, enforced and suffocating. The village had risen for one night, and for that, they paid with generations of fear. And yet, in the quiet, something else lingered, the knowledge that it had been possible, that the powerful were not invincible, that, even for a single night, the peasants had taken the world into their own hands. Time has a way of burying what the powerful want forgotten. Official records were scrubbed clean. Chroniclers reduced the event to a passing note of peasant madness, and the crown issued orders that the May festival continue elsewhere as though nothing had happened. But memory cannot be erased so easily. What survives in silence often grows more haunting than what is written in ink. In the decades after the uprising, the villagers carried their story like a phantom. Outwardly, life seemed to return to normal. Rents were paid, crops were harvested, festivals resumed. But something in the air had shifted, something unspoken that clung to the soil and the people who tilled it. Every maypole that was raised in the years that followed carried with it a shadow. For some, it was a reminder of vengeance, for others, of shame. For all, it was a reminder of what had happened when ordinary men and women allowed their rage to slip its leash. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story whispered at firesides. Grandmothers told it not as history, but as warning, don't cross the lords, or you'll bring ruin like they did that spring. Yet in the same breath, some mothers leaned close to their daughters and whispered it differently. Remember, they can bleed. They can fall. The story lived in contradiction, both a ghost of terror and a spark of hope, depending on who chose to remember and how. Superstition wrapped itself tightly around the tale. It was said that the soil beneath the old festival ground never yielded crops again, cursed by the blood that had soaked into it. Travelers spoke of seeing figures swaying in the wind long after the bodies had been cut down, ribbons and ropes blending into a grotesque dance. At night, villagers claimed to hear music drifting through the square, the faint echo of fiddles playing the festival songs, twisted and mournful, as if the dead still danced around the pole. Even the maypole itself became a figure of dread. In some neighboring villages, people refused to raise one for generations, fearing that to do so would invite rebellion or blasphemy. In others, the maypole returned but with altered customs. Some refused to use red ribbons, claiming that color was stained forever by the blood of landlords. Others braided ropes into the garlands, as though to acknowledge the hidden truth, that joy and violence had become inseparable. Folk songs emerged, cloaked in metaphor. One ballad spoke of 22 crows hanging from a tree, their wings broken, their eyes staring blankly at the sun. Another told of a dance where the ribbons were made of iron chains, and every step tightened them around the dancers' throats. To an outsider, these were strange rural songs, eerie but meaningless. To those who remembered, they were codes, preserving fragments of the story without naming it outright. The church tried to overwrite the memory with fear. Priests warned that the souls of the hanged landlords haunted the fields, seeking revenge on those who betrayed them. Some said the landlords appeared in dreams, choking sleepers with invisible ropes until they woke gasping. Others claimed livestock sickened each spring because the land itself rejected what had been done. These stories were meant to frighten peasants back into obedience, to make them fear their own act of rebellion. And yet, the villagers kept remembering in their own way. Memory is stubborn when it is born of hunger and blood. It passes not through parchment, but through whispers, lullabies, fragments of rhyme. Centuries later, when the uprising had become little more than rumor, its echoes still haunted the landscape. Psychologically, the rebellion scarred the community. Survivors carried guilt like a second skin. To look at the Maypole, even years later, even rebuilt, covered in flowers, was to see bodies swaying, faces turning blue, tongues swollen, and eyes bulging. Some could never again bring themselves to dance. For them, May Day was not rebirth, but mourning. Others, however, looked on with grim pride. They saw the pole not as a symbol of shame, but as proof that the powerless could make themselves feared, that even if the world punished them, they had carved a night of justice with their own hands. This duality is what kept the memory alive, shame interwoven with pride, fear braided with defiance. It was never one or the other. It was both. Even outside the village, the tale persisted. Rumors carried by merchants and pilgrims transformed the uprising into legend. Some told it as a story of demonic possession, where peasants were bewitched into slaughtering their lords. Others twisted it into a cautionary tale of chaos, proof that without order, the lower classes would devour their betters. But in secret, in hushed tones, the story inspired. In taverns and cottages far away, peasants whispered, "Did you hear of the Maypole? They rose up. They killed them all." For the oppressed, it was not horror, it was possibility. The Maypole became a symbol both sacred and cursed. To the authorities, it was cleansed and reclaimed, a harmless decoration of spring. But to those who remembered, it carried another meaning entirely. It was a reminder that beneath ribbons and flowers lies a darker truth. Joy can turn to blood, celebration to vengeance, and no festival is safe from the weight of injustice. The uprising's legacy was never written into history books, but it lingered in the atmosphere of rural life like smoke after a fire. For generations, every time villagers gathered to raise the pole, a question hovered in the back of their minds. Would it be ribbons this year, or ropes? And that is how stories survive, not in parchment and ink, but in the uneasy silence before a dance begins, in the nervous glances exchanged when laughter grows too loud, in the shadows cast by ribbons fluttering in the wind. History may bury the details, but memory clings to symbols. And in this case, the symbol was the Maypole, forever entwined with the ghosts of those who swung from it one blood-soaked spring night. Centuries have passed since the night when ribbons turned to ropes, but the ghost of the Maypole uprising lingers like a shadow stretching across time. The fields have changed hands, the cottages have crumbled, the gallows have rotted away. And yet, when one digs deep into the soil of history, the blood is still there, absorbed, hidden, but never gone. What happened in that forgotten village was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a glimpse into the raw tension between the powerful and the powerless, between the oppressed and the oppressor, a tension that has shaped the human story again and again. What makes the Maypole uprising so haunting is not only the brutality of the act itself, but the way it was erased. Official records reduced it to whispers, portraying the villagers as crazed, godless mobs. The landlords became martyrs, the peasants became demons. But when we peel back the layers of propaganda, we see something more complex. We see hunger. We see desperation. We see people who had been pushed too far and who, on one night, during a festival of flowers and joy, chose blood instead. And isn't that the most unsettling part? That ordinary people, farmers, mothers, laborers, the very same who sang and danced around the Maypole, could transform into executioners in the blink of an eye. That beneath the laughter of a festival, centuries of resentment simmered, waiting for a spark. When that spark came, it did not ignite a protest, or a plea, or a march. It ignited a slaughter. This is why the story matters. Not because it is rare, but because it is timeless. The same conditions, the yawning gap between rich and poor, the crushing weight of exploitation, the silence of those in power while their subjects suffer, can be found in every era of history. And when those conditions go unanswered, when despair festers into rage, the result is always the same: an explosion. Sometimes it comes as rebellion, sometimes as riot, sometimes as massacre, but it always comes. The Maypole Uprising is one of many forgotten revolts that litter the pages of the past. From peasant uprisings in medieval Europe, to slave revolts in the plantations of the Americas, to the labor strikes of the industrial age, again and again, those who hold power convince themselves that the oppressed will endure endlessly. And again, they are reminded that patience has a breaking point. There is a chilling symmetry to the story as well. The villagers sought justice, but what they achieved brought them only destruction. Their act of defiance was answered with punishments so brutal that generations afterward were silenced. Their uprising was not recorded as a demand for fairness, but as proof of savagery. This is the cruel pattern of history. When the powerless rise, their voices are buried, their actions demonized, their names erased. The victors write the story, and the victims are reduced to shadows. Yet shadows can still speak. The whispers of the Maypole Uprising remind us that history is not only what survives in books, but what lingers in the collective imagination. It's in the songs that twist celebration into mourning. It's in the superstitions that warn against red ribbons. It's in the ghost stories of bodies swaying where flowers once hung. Memory finds a way to survive, even when silenced. For us today, the story offers two warnings. The first is to those in power: cruelty has consequences. You cannot starve a people, whip them, tax them, and expect obedience forever. Fear may hold for a time, but when hunger gnaws and injustice piles high, fear loses its grip. The second warning is to the rest of U.S. Vengeance carries its own chains. The villagers' night of retribution was cathartic, yes, but it also condemned them. Their act, born of desperation, brought a tidal wave of suffering that crushed them harder than before. Justice, when taken by blood, can consume the very people who seek it. And yet, there is one more lesson, one that is darker still. Despite the reprisals, despite the silencing, the story did not die. It survived in whispers, in fragments, in shadows. And the idea it carried, that the mighty can fall, that the powerless can rise, survived with it. Ideas are harder to kill than people. And perhaps that is why the authorities worked so desperately to erase the uprising from memory. They feared the idea more than the act itself. Today, when we look at photographs of maypoles dressed in ribbons, bright with flowers, alive with dancers, it is easy to see only joy. But if you tilt your gaze just slightly, if you allow the past to seep through, the ribbons can begin to look like ropes. The flowers can begin to look like garlands for the dead. And the laughter can begin to sound hollow, as though the echoes of that night are still trapped in the wood. This is the power of history's darker corners. They remind us that beneath celebration, beneath ritual, beneath the gloss of culture and tradition, lies a raw truth about humanity. We are capable of great beauty and of great horror. Often, the two exist side by side, separated only by circumstance, waiting for the moment when one gives way to the other. So the next time you see a maypole standing tall in a village green, its ribbons fluttering in the spring breeze, remember that somewhere in the soil of history, there was once a maypole that bore not ribbons but men. 22 of them, landlords strung from the very pole that was meant to celebrate life. And remember that while their bodies fell, the memory of that night rose into legend, haunting the edges of history ever since. The story of the Maypole Uprising may be buried, but it is not gone. It lingers, a whisper in the wind, a chill in the air, a question that refuses to die. What happens when the powerless finally stop dancing and start pulling on the ropes instead?